Thank you for tuning in to this e-learning resource on insider fraud, which has been specifically created for Charity Fraud Awareness Week 2018. My name is Alan Bryce. I'm the Head of Counter Fraud and Cybercrime at the Charity Commission for England and Wales and Chair of the Charities Against Fraud Partnership. In this webinar, I will provide a brief overview of the insider fraud threat and in particular key messages from the Charity Commission's 2018 research on insider fraud. In the second part of this webinar, Pascal Nichols, Head of Central Finance at Amnesty International, will explore a recent insider fraud against the charity, the impact that fraud had, and how it was successfully addressed. So, what is insider fraud? Well, insider fraud is a fraud committed by somebody within the charity, such as a trustee, an employee, or a volunteer. How common is insider fraud? Well, research suggests that about a third of all frauds reported to the Charity Commission in 2016 were internal in nature. Other charities suggest, anecdotally, that up to 90% of the frauds they deal with each year are internal. Of course, the level of insider fraud at charities will vary depending on a number of factors, such as the size and nature of the charity and its charitable activities, as well as the existence and effectiveness of individual charities' own fraud defences. However, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that charities are more or less susceptible to insider fraud than organisations in the private or public sectors. In the 2018 Charity Commission research, the first ever research specifically on insider fraud in charities, there were some key findings. The full report, of course, can be found on the Charity Commission's own website. Well, in phase 1 of that research, the Charity Commission reviewed a sample of reported insider frauds. This found, perhaps surprisingly, that in 19 out of 20 of those cases, it was the complete absence of the appropriate controls that were the primary enabling factors that allowed that insider fraud to occur. In phase 2 of that research, there was an opportunity, as part of a call for evidence, for charities to provide their own views and draw their own conclusions as to who committed the fraud and why. So, who committed those insider frauds? Well, in 43% of those cases, it was by an employee, in 33% by trustee, in 10% by volunteer, 10% by others, and 4% of people did not respond to that question. Of course, although the vast majority of people involved with charities are fundamentally honest, these findings demonstrate that anyone, an employee, a trustee, or a volunteer, can potentially, given the opportunity and motive, commit fraud against a charity. So, in those cases, what were the factors that contributed to the fraud occurring? Well, the three most important factors were excessive trust or responsibility. This was the factor in 43% of those frauds. A lack of challenge or oversight in 24% of the case of those frauds, and an absence of controls or the existing controls being poorly applied in 24% of the cases. These results suggest that it is vital that charities create a very strong counter-fraud culture that encourages an appropriate degree of skepticism and of challenge if they are able to effectively tackle insider fraud. In terms of the action taken in the reporting, well, encouragingly, 38% of the charities recovered part or all of the money or assets taken. This is significantly higher than we would typically see in the private or public sectors. In 81% of the cases, the charities undertook a review of the adequacy of controls. Again, this is very good practice. It's the learning from the frauds that will allow not just those charities but other charities to better prepare themselves and strengthen their defences against insider fraud. In 9% of the frauds reported to the authorities, these resulted in prosecutions. Again, this is significantly higher than we normally see in the private or public sectors. However, only 62% of the charities concerned reported those frauds to Action Fraud or the police, and only 57% reported to the Charity Commission. It would appear that fraud reporting, both to the police and the Charity Commission, remains low. I would encourage all charities to report fraud. It is only through the timely sharing of information on current and emerging fraud threats that we can all together develop robust fraud prevention defences for all charities. So, in terms of the conclusions that research drew, first, it's important that charities ensure that the counter-fraud controls are both in place and are consistently and robustly applied. And charities should be particularly mindful that the majority of insider frauds were enabled due to either excessive trust or responsibility placed on one person or individual, or a lack of challenge or oversight. Now, Pascal Nichols from Amnesty International will outline the impact of a recent insider fraud and the successful action taken by the charity to tackle that fraud.
Hello, I'm Pascal Nichols from Amnesty International. I want to talk to you about a recent insider fraud case study, explain what happened, our response, what we learned from this, and how the incident will inform our fraud resilience strategy. So once upon a time, we hired a lovely accounts payable clerk. He was bright, picked things up quickly, was proactive, helpful, always willing to stay late to sort out issues, and was loved by staff within and outside of finance. He worked with us for 18 months until early 2017, and we were very sad when he resigned. But we kept in touch with him, and he often came to visit the office and tell us his news. But then disaster. 6 months after he left, we were doing a routine reconciliation of our foreign exchange gains and losses account when we suddenly noticed some very small, unusual transactions. We started to realize that the account contained hundreds of expense write-offs processed by this AP clerk, each between £50 and £500, with descriptions relating to hotels, restaurants, flights, and even a cruise. The total amount written off amounted to around £80,000. Our first reaction was there must have been some sort of mistake, but when we looked into it objectively, we realized he'd used staff corporate credit cards to purchase holidays, hotels, and meals for himself, family, and friends, and he'd written all these items off to an account with a huge number of transactions where they would be well hidden. Over the next couple of days of looking into it, we had to accept the person we liked and robbed had defrauded Amnesty of tens of thousands of pounds. So what did we do immediately? The first thing we did was get on the phone. We called our external audit partner, who pointed us to a checklist of things we needed to do. Secondly, we ensured his access to our systems had definitely been stopped when he left, which it had. We also cancelled the 20 credit cards that had been used for these transactions. The most important things at this stage were communication and confidentiality, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. The immediate communications were vitally important, so we spoke in person to the CEO and the senior management team. We answered their questions and ensured management agreed with the proposal to take this case to prosecution. We also identified funding lost to fraud, grant funding, and communicated this to the funder. We set up a small working group with staff from finance, legal, and HR departments, and we logged a serious incident with the Charity Commission. In terms of confidentiality, we had to ensure that everyone who was informed about this knew they had to keep it to themselves, but in case the story did get out, we also developed media communications. So what has happened in the last 12 months? So initially, we commissioned an externally led investigation, and we implemented the high priority recommendations from that. And this gave us assurance that we didn't have any big control gaps, but we also brainstormed other possible areas of weakness and checked if he had exploited these. We gathered witness statements from those whose credit cards had been used fraudulently, and we called action fraud to register the case with the police. So between 3 and 6 months, we repaid the grant funding lost to fraud to the funder, and we ensured all other recommendations from the external investigation had been implemented. And then we started to work with the police to create a file of evidence. At that point, they arrested the AP clerk, but he was released on bail whilst they completed the preparations for prosecution. And we told the finance team immediately following his arrest, and at this point we had to deal with the team's feelings of shock, betrayal and guilt that we had already gone through, and that was a very difficult time. But we tried to turn that emotion into positive action by shortly afterwards running an Amnesty Asset Protector workshop for finance staff that was well received. Following that, we worked to provide information for the police and the Criminal Prosecution Service, and he was finally sentenced at the end of July to 21 months imprisonment. Whilst we were waiting for the court case, we had to develop a communication strategy for both our internal and external stakeholders. So internally, we developed an email that could be sent to all staff outlining the incident and our response, and we wanted to use the shock as an opportunity to increase fraud awareness. Externally, we sent regular updates to the Charity Commission, And we also developed a strategy to deal with comms in the charity press. We didn't really expect it to hit the wider media, although, as you may be aware, the story was published in the Mail online. So what did we learn? Firstly, several of our credit card holders had reported fraudulent transactions on their credit cards, but in which case the bank always refunded us these items, no questions asked. So it's really important to be aware that no one is above suspicion. When we heard people discussing these frauds with him, we assumed that they were just the normal level of external fraud, and we really should have looked into these. As an organisation, we thought we were prepared. We had a fraud strategy and we had run fraud awareness weeks in the past, but despite that, the board and the CEO had not got the message that fraud is happening all around us. It was a massive shock to them that a fraud had been discovered and they felt something had gone badly wrong, and they reacted very strongly. This would make it hard for us to act systematically. Even though we thought we ticked all the boxes on controls and the auditors did not report any control gaps in this area, the AP clerk had managed to use his personality and creativity to get round all of our controls. The controls only form part of our fraud resilience strategy. And in terms of the investigation, we had to drop everything to address the fraud as soon as it was identified. We should have deprioritised more non-essential projects and focused on this. So overall, the board and the SMT now feel that we were unlucky to be attacked and defrauded by this individual, and they are pleased that we have detected it and we have responded appropriately. But if we had known these things, we might not have lost so much, and the process would have definitely been smoother. And I really hope these lessons can be of some help to you and your organisations. So what next? As part of our ongoing fraud mitigation strategy, we have updated our fraud risk controls analysis and continue to enhance our controls when needed. We're planning to deliver ongoing staff workshops so staff understand the nature of fraud in the modern era. We can heighten their awareness of fraud indicators, and we can get all staff to commit to being an Amnesty asset protector to prevent, detect and report suspected fraud. We've also recently developed a new e-learning module, and it will be mandatory for all new starters to complete this as part of their induction. And we are now busy preparing for our third Fraud Awareness Week that will also include, for the first time, more on ethical procurement and cybercrime. Thank you for listening. Please do not forget to check out the free resources available as part of Charity Fraud Awareness Week. This includes our brand new help sheets on insider fraud and whistleblowing, which have been released today. You can find these resources on the Fraud Advisory Panel website or by following #CharityFraudOut on Twitter.